Hello, everyone, and welcome to our lecture on section 7.1, Shifting Powers After 1900. In this lecture, the essential question is, how did internal and external factors contribute to change in various states after 1900? In this one, we're going to take a look at 4 states. We're going to look at the Russian Empire. We're going to take a look at the Chinese Empire. We're also going to take a look at the Ottoman Empire and the Republic of Mexico. All right, so let's get started. All right, so to set the stage, you guys need to understand a few things. In the very first 2 decades of the 20th century, so 1900 to 1920, there's rebellions that erupted all across the world against some long-standing, very authoritarian governments in Russia, China, and Mexico. And then, even though it wasn't a rebellion, we're going to see something that's actually going to happen within the Ottoman Empire as well. We're going to see ruling governments that are going to be unseated. We're going to see challenges to the existing political and social orders that existed in these countries, and which lead to institutions of the party that comes into control where they develop their own political philosophies and practices. We're going to see these empires, which have long been established land or maritime-based empires, they're going to collapse due to these internal and external forces. And so much so, with a variety of everything else that we're going to talk about moving forward in this last half or last part of AP World History, we're going to see a new global order emerge by the end of the century, even though we're going to be focusing in this section just on the first 20 years. All right, so let's talk about Russia first. So in the early 20th century, Russia was starting to fall behind the rest of Europe and the United States and Japan, with Japan being probably the most embarrassing one because Japan was very late to the game for industrialization, and then for another reason we're going to talk about here in just a second. But the internal problems that Russia was facing is their economic growth was very slow or stagnant in most places. They were very slow to educate their people, particularly the peasants. They had just recently, in the 1860s, outlawed or got rid of serfdom. So they're very slow to this process. When you look at the rest of the countries that we just talked about previously, their populations were already educated, or at least education reform had been started and was beginning to be in its full swing. The transportation network across Russia needed to be built up significantly. It was very slow, in some places non-existent, and part of the problem was the fact that they were such a large country. Also, the government didn't really support entrepreneurship and private business expansion by giving them money, loans, and so forth. And then the Tsarist government itself, and this is perhaps the worst part about it, is they were resistant to reforms. There were a lot of calls for reforms, and they were very resistant to it, such as reforms in civil liberties and government participation for the people, and that was severely lacking. But all these internal problems led to external problems. So, for example, the lack of economic growth, it being slow or stagnant, actually led to military problems or problems for the support for the Russian military, and we see these problems manifest themselves in losses in conflicts, such as in the Crimean War in the early to mid part of the 19th century, and then the Russo-Japanese War at the very beginning of the century, where the Japanese are very easily defeat the Russian forces. All right, so what ends up happening is by 1917, Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks are able to seize and set up a communist government in Russia. Now, I purposely avoided for this lecture the revolution of 1905 and what happens in World War I with Russia, because we're going to focus on that in somewhere else. But anyways, by 1917, we're seeing that the Bolsheviks are able to seize power and set up the world's first communist government. And what they ultimately try to do is they want the workers to be able to own the means of production, and then they hope that collective ownership among the workers leads to collective prosperity and justice, things that they didn't see under the rule of the imperial family in the Russian Empire. So what the Soviet government does is they do issue several reforms in the beginning. They abolish private trade. They start to distribute peasants' crops to feed the people evenly, whether they're in urban areas or in rural areas, and they start to take over the ownership of the factories and heavy industries of the country. Now, while all this is going on, they're fighting a civil war. You have the Red forces, which are the Bolsheviks, and they are fighting the White forces, those that want to restore the imperial powers, the royal family. And they actually have backing by many of the European countries, Western European countries. But the Russian Civil War goes to the side of the Reds or the Bolsheviks, and this completely shocks the world and leads to many of the capitalist countries across the world, including the United States and France and Britain mainly. They start to fear that communism is going to spread and become a problem globally. And this is actually what we would consider the first Red Scare, whether you want to just say it's the first Red Scare for the whole world or just in U.S. history that you can do. All right, so let's move on. So now we're going to talk about upheaval in China. We've already talked about some of this stuff already, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but China's facing a lot of internal problems. They have ethnic tensions. Particularly, you have the ruling imperial family, which are the Manchus, which aren't ethnically Chinese. They're diverse from the Han Chinese, which is the majority of the population. There's some tensions there. Then in China, as this has been a problem throughout their history, they have problems with famine and natural disaster. In particular, floods and drought are very common in China. And when you add in the fact that they have a high population, they don't have the ability or technology to actually produce agriculturally enough to feed the people. And when these natural disasters hit, thousands die. And that causes instability and animosity towards whoever's in power, whether you want to look at, in this case, in the 1900s or the start of the 20th century, or, several thousand years ago. And then also you have low government revenues. There's an outdated tax system that's in place in China, which means that the infrastructure of China can't be built up, and it's starting to fall apart. So like canals are falling apart, roads are falling apart, or their bridges and stuff are falling apart, or they just need to be built. They're not being built. So the external challenges that China's facing is there's an influx of European influence into the Chinese markets. And we've talked about this earlier in Unit 6 with the role that Europeans started to play into China after the Opium Wars. And it's that setting up of the spheres of influence and the Europeans creating a market that's more beneficial to them. Then there's also a trade deficit between the Chinese and Europeans as well, because the Europeans want Chinese goods, but the Chinese don't want European goods. And then you add the fact that there's an imperial desire by the Empress Dowager to maintain the old ways of Chinese society. It leads to conflict. And in particular, one of the most important conflicts here is the Boxer Rebellion that we talked about in the last unit. So continuing along in China, even though there was this support at this turn of the century by, the Boxers and a significant group of people for the Empress Dowager and returning to old ways, this doesn't last. And the Qing dynasty is ultimately overthrown in 1911, and there's a republic set up in China led by Sun Yat-sen. Now, his party, the Nationalist Party, or the Kuomintang, they follow a platform of following the traditional Confucian principles of loyalty and morality. They want Chinese sovereignty and democracy and kind of pushing out the foreign influence so they can prove themselves. They want to focus on nationalism and support specifically for the Nationalist Party. And they want to promote economic livelihood and equality so that the people themselves can actually start to achieve and advance. There's some problems, though, and this was actually a problem that had existed before the Republican government came into power, but this was exacerbated by the fact that they didn't have complete control and it was taking time with a new government, is that Sun Yat-sen's government lacked military control, and the previous problem of warlords gaining control of regional parts of the country actually expands, and the warlords come to control the majority of the country. And this actually leads to Sun Yat-sen's resignation and kind of a warlord period of control in China. Now, that won't last for a significant period of time, but ultimately what will happen is the Kuomintang will regain power, but they're going to lose power after World War II in 1949 when they're defeated by the Communist Chinese in the Chinese Civil War. All right, so now on to the Ottomans, our old friend, the sick man of Europe. So we already know the problems that they're having, but by the 20th century, they're losing territory to Europe. Whether it's European powers taking territory and adding their empire, or new countries coming up and gaining independence. You're starting to see fewer and fewer exports coming out of the Ottoman Empire, and their agricultural economy is starting to wane. There's a lack of industrialization, and that's a problem. So what ends up happening is a group known as the Young Turks actually start pushing for influence into the government. They fail initially, but then actually gain control, and they argue for certain reforms. One, they want a new European-style-based constitution, and they push for Turkification, which is that they want all citizens to identify as Turkish and possibly Muslim. And this actually is going to be a problem and going to lead into an issue that we're going to talk about later on in Unit 7 when we get to the mass atrocities part, where they're going to have issues with the Christian Armenians, because there's going to be a piece of animosity there between the Young Turks and the Armenians. Another problem is the foreign investments before World War I into the Ottoman Empire, specifically that from Britain and France, was becoming too much, and the European powers were gaining too much influence into the Turkish economy and government and so forth. This leads to resentment by the Turks, specifically the Young Turks, and they start calling for allies, and this is actually why the Turks end up siding with the Central Powers and allying themselves with Germany in World War I. Now, ultimately, we know that Germany loses World War I, the Ottomans lose World War I, and the result of that is the Allies end up dismantling the Ottoman Empire. They take land for themselves, and they leave a small base territory for the Turks, and that'll become eventually the Republic of Turkey and so forth. Now, in 1921, Turkish nationalists under Mustafa Kemal, who you see here on screen, they actually defeat the British forces that are sent there to occupy the country, help maintain order. They defeat them and push it out. And then ultimately what will happen is they'll fight a war actually with the Greeks in this period, and then in 1923 they'll establish the Turkish Republic with Mustafa Kemal as their leader, and he's given the title Ataturk, or Father of the Turks. Now, under Kemal, he will actually focus on reforming Turkey. Even though he's a president and he's elected official, he'll actually rule as a dictator until he leaves office, or until he dies, excuse me. But he will actually focus us on trying to establish Turkey as a secular nation, kind of getting away from the tensions of Islam and or Christianity and so forth. At least he tries to do that. He starts to push public education for both boys and girls, and start to expand suffrage for women as well in his country. Now, lastly, we're going to talk about what happens in Mexico. Now, in Mexico, at the start of the 20th century, they're led by a dictator, Porfirio Diaz, and there are some benefits to his rule. There's stability and some economic progress going in at this time, but there's significant drawbacks that actually are greater in that they do allow the benefits to happen, but they over time are leading to resentment and causing other problems. So there's some foreign investors, mainly the United States, are controlling most of Mexico's resources, and really the wealth is only at the top, and the peasants are landless and don't really have anything. So after all these problems and some strong arming by the Diaz government, the last straw is in 1910, Diaz jails his opposition opponent, Madero, and this leads to the actual Mexican Revolution. Now, what will happen is Pancho Villa, who's a commander within Madero's forces, is actually able to defeat government Mexican troops, and this leads to Diaz being exiled, and a new change in government, led by Madero and people like Emiliano Zapata, who is instrumental in starting to redistribute the land in Mexico so that the peasants can actually start having some land. Now, to make a long story short, because we don't have time, there's going to be political violence and instability that's going to last in Mexico really from 1910 to 1930. But ultimately, there's going to be two big effects from these conflicts. One, they're going to develop a new constitution where there's going to be land distribution, public education for all, and universal suffrage. And then two, there's going to be a new political party that's formed, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, that's going to go on to dominate Mexican politics for the remainder of the century, with, I think, until 2000, every single Mexican president is going to actually come from this party. So there's going to be some kind of corruption in political issues that are going to develop in Mexico after this time, but that's for a later time in this course. All right, guys, I'll see you in the next one.